Greetings, denizens of the Megabranthus cluster. Mightily shall we struggle today to make a Mosaic Damascus blade for the recently completed Native American War Club project. Something you know by now didn't really end up with a Mosaic Damascus blade. Mosaic Damascus is a form of pattern development and pattern welded Damascus where layers of steel are stacked and welded into a billet, which is usually deformed in some way to alter its basic stripe pattern. The resulting billet is usually cut up in a variety of ways, and the pieces are rearranged like small bits of mosaic artwork and forge welded together to form a larger pattern. These examples are by Joshua Prince at Princeworks Forge. He's an Omega level craftsman and true master of mosaic. You need to follow him on Instagram at Princeworks Forge. This attempt is based on, to a large degree, on one of the patterns he outlined on his Instagram feed recently. Let's talk about the pattern we'll be attempting. First, flat thin bars of alternating 1095, which etch dark, and 15 and 20, which etch bright, are welded together into a square. Then the square is going to be turned on its corners and squashed. The billet is rotated and squashed until a cylinder-like object is made, and then it's going to be squished back into sort of a rectangle or flat. In this case, we'll be squishing it such that it makes these longitudinal type elongated U's. You could squish it the other way and make the beginnings of crushed W's. The billet is flattened and then cut into pieces which are stacked on each other and welded together, then flattened again. And this is the first part of our final billet. We're going to be putting a thin piece of high contrasting 15 and 20 underneath it, and then a second larger pattern welded billet is going to go under that. The large billet on the bottom can be any pattern you want. The one on top can be any pattern you want for that matter. So we have a large simple billet on the bottom, then a smaller, fairly well-developed pattern block on top, and then a thin piece of 15 and 20 steel in between them. These will be welded together into a square, which is then going to be turned on its corners, which will be completely flattened, and the billet will be re-squared on the corners like so, and you get the pattern really sort of changing at that point. That billet is cut into 4 pieces and arranged into another square like this. And that is going to be forge welded together, and then it'll be cut up and stacked so that you get an elongated pattern there that you could make a blade out of. So far so good, or so it would seem at any rate. But we'll see here in just a second there's actually a problem. I'm having trouble dialing in the oxidation in my forge, and so the flame is a little too oxidizing now, and it's broken this billet up, so I'm going to have to start over. Since I can't get my forge dialed in exactly where I want it, I'm just going to start forge welding in canisters. So I've got this titanium dioxide powder I've mixed as a paste, put it on the inside of these canisters. It works well. I think it works better than liquid paper. It's cheaper than liquid paper, and it hasn't had a failure yet, and I've had some failures with liquid paper. So the reason I'm doing this in a canister is because you're eliminating oxygen from the mix, at least mostly so. So you're not going to form a scale, especially in an oxidizing environment in your forge. And so we might get some better welds out of it. The other reason is that you see all that stuff sort of flaking off the billet. Well, in this case, that's a mild steel canister, and you're losing steel from the canister, and it doesn't matter. But if you're doing a lot of forging with a billet, a naked billet, the steel that's being flaked off is good steel. It's part of your billet, and you're losing that good steel, and your billet just gets progressively smaller. If you have the time, energy, and can spend the money on the mild steel, a canister is just sort of where it's at. It does add quite a bit of time to forging, but I think in some cases it's probably worth it. All right, I think we're back on track. So now we're going to squish our corners down and make sort of that cylinder we were talking about in an effort ultimately to sort of curve our lines and make that globe type pattern you see in the bottom left corner. It's not going to stay a globe because we're going to squish it flat. And after we squish it flat, we're going to take it, cut it into bits, and again stack those pieces on top of each other, and then we'll forge weld those together. So far, we're right on track. This is about how I expected it to look, and things are progressing pretty well. We'll get it cleaned up, cut up, and we'll talk about our next set of billets we're going to make, because we're sort of going to separate things. We're going to make one billet for that top portion of our final pattern, and then we're going to take and make another stack of these to use for our bottom portion. I'm matching these to make sure I understand exactly how the pattern falls out on each of the pieces, and then we'll try to stack them such that they match as best we can get them to match up with each other. Again, one of these is going to be used for the top portion, and another, this larger group here, is going to be used to forge out that bottom portion of our final billet. Here they are coming out of their respective canisters, and everything looks good so far. Alright, so in my right hand is going to be the bottom portion of our billet, and on the left hand is going to be the top portion of our billet, which we're going to manipulate a little bit more and make that pattern a little bit finer. So here's the bottom, and you can see how dark it's getting along the sides there while I was pressing it under the press. And that is too dark. I'm going to pay for that here in a minute. Yeah, you guessed it, we're going to have some problems. You can't compress dark gray steel under a 16-ton press and expect everything just to be okay. We'll go ahead and work on the top for now. I'll make up another simple low layer count billet to go on bottom here in a minute. But for now, we're going to manipulate this a little bit more and squish it down, flatter obviously. And by the way, the drawing shows these as oriented horizontally, that our line's going to be going horizontal, and that's just not going to be the case. They're going to open up more if we position them so that they're vertically oriented. So you'll see that when I etch it here. So here we go. On top, we have the billet we just made successfully. On the bottom, I've made up a new low layer count billet. And then in the middle, there's our layer of 15 and 20 steel. On the outside, that's an angle iron canister I'm making. Yeah, baby, canister. Yeah, it looks pretty good all cleaned up. I like it. So remember, from here, the plan is to put it back in the press on its corners and re-square it up on its corners. So just press the corners flat. I'm anxious to know what this looks like, so I cut off the tip and decided to etch it for a quick sneak peek. So the tip is a little squishy mushy, and it's not going to be it doesn't represent the final pattern. So, oh, Steve, no, hey, don't worry, buddy. That looks a lot more workable. So I've drawn out these lines here, and that is way too many lines. I need to cut this into 4 pieces, not like 16 pieces. I'm not sure exactly what I'm thinking about here, but this is not how it's done. So this is what I have left after cutting off those pieces that were too small. I cut off 4 pieces that were too small, and those are just wasted at this point. Here, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So we had a piece like this. It's supposed to be cut into 4 pieces so I can restack them and arrange them like this, right? And then forge weld that together. And instead, I started cutting it up these really teeny tiny pieces that I can't use. So those have to be thrown away. That circle there is all that's left of our good steel. And that's what I've gone back and cut into 4 pieces. And now I have to try and cobble those together to make our war club. So if we cut the tip off and etch it, that's sort of what we're working with. I'm hoping that it sort of centers itself a little bit better as you move further down into the bar, but this is what it looks like on the end. And again, so the one on the right is the bar we just all put together, and the one on the left are those useless pieces we cut off. And you can see exactly how much steel that whole thing cost us. So now I've switched spots. The ones on the left we have to forge weld together to make our blade. The ones on the right are the useless pieces we have left over. Huge mistake. That's going to cost this project entirely. So trying to forge weld these bits together when they're so tall and thin is just going to be impossible, really. So what I've devised is a canister with sort of a blank slot at the top that I'm going to try to forge weld another piece in there that's going to stick out above the rest of the canister so that when the forge comes down, it presses that top part and squishes just our billets, leaving the side walls of our canister intact to support the billet from lateral deviation so that all the force is applied directly straight up and down. This is just like a fool's errand, but it's all I'm left with, so I'm going to try it. No, there's a delamination there. Runs about 1/4 of an inch into the piece. So we're either calling it quits, or I can make one more canister. And this time I'll put some flux in the canister with it and some bits of paper to suck out all the oxygen. We'll try to keep it as stable as possible by making it this angle, right angle in there, and just see what happens. So actually that did close up about half of that delam. There's still a bit left I'm going to grind out ultimately. I'm trying to flatten it out and just get enough steel out of this that we might be able to pursue the project, but ultimately there's just not enough steel to make what I need to make. So I'm going to hammer it out so that I can get my bevels and get a long enough piece and a point. This is not something you would ever do with Damascus, or especially Mosaic Damascus. Hammering it will just deform the pattern. It really works against everything you've done to this point, but I don't have enough steel to work with, so it's just going to have to happen. And at this point, it really is a foregone conclusion that this is a bust. So as you'll see here in a minute, our efforts are really sort of squandered, but I learned a lot. That's all that really matters. Have a good one.